Hello and welcome back to another episode of me just speed drawing. So today I am doing something that I like to do a lot, and I've mentioned it in a previous video. I really enjoy finding a color palette, drawing something, and then trying to make that color palette look good with it. And it is harder than it sounds, often because when you're drawing without consideration of color, you often have areas where saturation is very similar or the color palette clashes and you don't realize, because sometimes a palette looks good but all the colors don't necessarily look good with each other. So that was actually the case with this palette, which was mostly red with a sort of mustardy yellow. So I thought that this would look good with all of the colors, but it really doesn't. It has a hard time standing out next to especially the second darkest color. So there are some things that you can do to change the contrast of the colors, the first of which is, of course, shading, and then also just like problem solving in the way that you're connecting the different colors. When I thought about this color palette, I thought about a spotlight, because obviously most of the colors were very similar, but there was that one standout color, so I wanted to see if I could do some kind of a spotlight effect. And I think it turned out great. I'll let you be the judge of that, actually, but I think it turned out fantastically. So right now I'm just sort of drawing a singer, because I thought spotlight, performer, singer, it all works out. There's a very clear thought process going on. But I feel like my sketch turned out really, really well, and I was kind of worried when I started doing the line art, because the sketch isn't necessarily the most defined thing in the world. It's a very sketchy sketch, and usually sketchy sketch, of course. Usually I would do a second layer of sketches just to confirm where the lines that I want to follow actually are, but I didn't, because I really liked this first version of the sketch. It felt very organic, very flowy, and very lifelike, which is something that is hard to capture if you keep going over the same sketch over and over. That's something that happens when you're sketching. When you're first sketching, your objective should not be to make good lines, to make perfect lines, to do whatever. Your first objective, I can't talk. Your first objective should be gestural. You want to get the flow of the pose, get the energy of the pose first, because every subsequent layer you do on top of that, your drawing is going to get stiffer. There's basically nothing you can do about it. But having that first initial pose be very flowy, very organic, very not perfect allows you more room for error. If you start out stiff, you can only get stiffer. So I was experimenting with maybe just doing one sketch layer instead of 8 billion. Maybe I'll get some more lifelike facial expressions then. So I'm not exactly sure who the singer I was looking at for a reference was. It looked like Lana Del Rey, but if you think it looks like a different singer, let me know. I would love to know who it looks like, because she does look familiar. For the line art, I'm not using a black brush, but I am using the Inking Thick and Thin brush. I'm using the dark red color, and I'm using it specifically because it's not black. It really makes the color palette mesh together a little bit better. Sometimes when you use black line art, it can strongly overpower everything else that you're looking at. So in using a color that's dark but maybe a bit more skin toned, you don't get that. Also, something I've been doing a lot lately is painterly shading, and I did not want to do that today. I wanted to do cell shading, because cell shading is just as important a skill as painterly shading. It takes less time and often creates a very different result. And because I wanted the light source to be very stark and dramatic, having a painterly shadows and painterly highlights would be less dramatic than just straight up sharp highlights. And I do start trying with a soft highlight at first, but I don't like it as much. As far as clothing and outfit goes, it was very standard, just kind of hoodie thing. Not necessarily a performer, but maybe someone doing karaoke or something like that. But I'm pretty happy with how the folds on the clothing turned out. That's something that I'm always practicing. And I feel like I got quite a bit of it right with this drawing. And I was having a little bit of trouble with her hair today. At some point, you can work something to death and still not be happy with it. So at some point you just kind of have to cut your quote-unquote losses and move on. It's probably not even as bad as you often think it is. So part of me just wanted to completely start her hair over. But in the end, I think it turned out fine, and sometimes something like that does happen where you think that something is going to turn out terribly, and then it actually turns out wonderfully. So I would say, if you are an artist, don't beat yourself up too hard about little errors or start completely over when you think something's gone wrong. Sometimes you just have to keep pushing, and you will eventually end up at a product that you like. Not to say, you shouldn't try and fix mistakes you think you've made, but focusing too hard on those mistakes is not beneficial for your art. Something kind of weird about this and the color palette that I ended up with is she looks a lot like Ariel from The Little Mermaid, and I didn't necessarily realize it until I was editing. She's got that bright red hair, and her shirt ends up being like a pink, like Ariel's dress from the movie when she's a human. But it's not her, okay? Ariel has blue eyes and this gal has brown eyes. I guess you could pretend if you really wanted. So this is one of those situations where I was like thinking really hard about what color to use, because I'm out of options at this point for the hem of her hoodie, for the hood, because I've used the skin tone and that's interacting with it. I've used the pink, that's interacting with it, the red is interacting with it, and the darkest red is interacting with it. So the only color I hadn't used was that mustardy orange color, and that did not look good up against the bright red of her hair. So in situations like that, it's like, yes, I used a color palette and basically failed in using only that color palette, because I end up using a lighter version of the color of her jacket. Not a true palette challenge because I didn't have any forethought, but stuff like that is what I'm talking about when I say like the colors and how you're thinking of them when you're drawing is incredibly important. So I do these palette challenges to get me to think about, like, in the future, think about more about where I'm placing colors and how they relate to the colors around them. And also, it's just a fun challenge. Sometimes these palettes inspire things that I wouldn't necessarily draw otherwise. So what I've done right now is I've put the dark color over top, and I've just painted out a little bit of lighting, and I don't like it. And then I'm trying to use the darkest color as a shader, and I don't like that. So I end up using the red color, the color that's her hair, as a shader on a multiply layer, and drop it down to about 70% opacity. And I liked that a lot better. Sometimes shadows being too dark isn't beneficial to the drawing. And I know when you think like shadows, you think, oh, it's dark, I'll just draw with black. But shadows are colored, so, and it sounds crazy to say it, but shadows are actually colored based on the light reflecting, where the shadow's coming from, the color of the light. So often drawings that look very flat, or beginners that are drawing, will shade with like a gray or a black or something along those lines. And it often turns out a little odd, especially on certain color palettes. Like, for example, if I shaded with a blue on this color palette or a gray, it would look very, very strange up against the red. A blue might be interesting because that would create a kind of purple effect, which could be cool, but at the same time, a black wouldn't do that. A black would just desaturate the color, which leads to the drawing looking a little bit more flat and lifeless, especially in the face. So if I can recommend anything in this video, it's your shadows, try coloring them. It makes a huge difference, especially in illustrative work. In realistic work, you could consider more realistically that the shadows aren't going to be as brightly colored as the ones here, but there are still colors in realistic shadows, you know? They're still not solid gray, so it's almost never fully appropriate to shade with gray, as opposed to another more colorful color, unless you're shading metal. But even then, you've got like blues and greens. It's very complicated. But here I am adding that goldy color as finally a spotlight. I ended up using it as a color dodge layer as opposed to anything else because I really liked the way it brightened her up. I thought that was fantastic. And at this point, I'm mostly done. I'm just adding highlights and messing around a little bit more with blending modes and stuff. But I had a great time drawing this. It was an excellent little relaxing piece for me, which is fantastic that I get to have a break from all of my schoolwork. But if you liked the video, please let me know, leave a like, and if you have any specific color palettes you'd like me to try drawing, I would also appreciate that if you would leave that in the comments down below. Oh, I almost forgot, at the end, I wanted to make it look more interesting, and she has a very specific look on her face, so I added tears dripping down her face, just because I thought it makes you wonder a lot more about what she's singing about, and it really suited the expression on her face and stuff. So, that just a subtle thing like that is an element of storytelling that sort of adds to the illustration in a way that, you know, might not be the most expected thing in the world. And after that, I'm basically done. I added some highlights to her hair and lips, and deepened the shading a little bit. But yes, I had a great time with this, and thank you again so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day and all that jazz.